Well, greetings to all of you. Thanks for joining the Corporate Soul. This is Tyler Norton. Excited for our podcast and appreciate those of you that are joining. I hope, again, you're finding these to be helpful. I certainly am enjoying. I find myself really looking forward to being able to share some of these principles. Have high hopes that people out there are seeing some value, and maybe it's creating some introspection that you can bring to bear and apply in your own personal life, the lives and relationships you have at home or at work, or even in leading and guiding your own business. So thanks for joining. Great to have you back and to be back. Today, I want to take a few minutes and talk about a principle that I've learned from my dad. Those of you that might be listening for the first time, my father retired from Chicago to Park City, Utah. I'm here in the mountains of Utah right now. And when he finished his career at that moment, I mean, again, he was in his mid-50s. We've done several things since then, but he was the head of strategy at Kraft Foods, reporting to the CEO, then Jim Kiltz. Jim was the CEO of Kraft, has been the CEO of Nabisco, Gillette, Oscar Mayer, a number of great companies. And my dad was really privileged, actually, to not only work with him in that capacity as a VP of strategy, reporting to Jim, but really for 22 years, Dad and Jim had a great run together in various settings. I remember distinctly as a young man going back to Chicago. I was finishing up a degree at the University of Utah, and I went back to Chicago to sit down with my dad when he was in that role. And I asked him, I said, I want you to help me understand how you think more strategically and what it is that the processes and the think tracks, if you will, that you go through. Some of you that have heard me speak in large group settings have heard me tell the story that when I asked him for advice, we were sitting on a Lake Michigan dinner cruise, and I said, I have some questions and I want some advice. What would you give me as advice as a young, really aggressive young business person? I wanted to succeed, and I wanted my dad's input. And I remember being really excited and anxious to hear what he had to say. And he kind of looked off into the distance. Again, we were on this dinner cruise, and we were finishing dinner. And he turned back and looked at me, and he said one word, which I was so disappointed in at the time. He said, think. And I said, that's it? That's all you've got for me? You're the head of strategy of a $36 billion multinational company with tons of brands, and you're telling me that your advice is to think. And then he proceeded to say, and I'll paraphrase it, you know, Tyler, most people aren't willing to invest in the real work of thinking. They mostly get into jobs, they do what they think the scope of their work is, but they don't really outthink their job. And he goes, I think the most important piece of advice I could give to you would be to think and learn how to think critically. Well, what then happened is I double-clicked in on that was I said, okay, so what do you think about? And it was really neat. It started really almost a love affair for me of my dad's critical thinking paths and how he applied those and used those in Fortune 50. To be very candid, any success that I've had in my career since that time, and this has now been over 20 years ago, has largely been because he taught me how to think more like a CEO, to think critically and put myself in the shoes of various senior leaders of the company. And as I've shared in various podcasts, prior podcasts, I had some unique opportunities. I was an officer of a $4 billion enterprise when I was in my early 30s. I was a C-suite officer by my mid-30s. And a lot of that happened because of these things that my dad had taught me. And so I want to share some of what I took from that. And to be honest, there are four major sections of these podcasts that I want to be hitting over time. One, of course, is ethos heavy. It's what is the defining spirit and distinguishing spirit of your culture? What are the fundamental values and those things that make your organization or you personally peculiar as you look and compare yourself to others? And I like to think of that corporate or that ethos as a corporate soul. Meaning, if a corporation is a body, can it have a soul? And there's a big part of what I like to cover in these podcasts that point to how do you nurture, how do you stay focused on, how do you promote your own corporate soul? How do you do that in terms of sharing it with your employees, sharing it with people that are in your ecosystem in a way that both inspires them and that's authentic? And so a big portion of what I want to share in these podcasts points to that concept of corporate soul. But boy, another area that is so compelling and that I've been really favored to learn and understand is an area around strategic clarity and strategic thinking. And so it'll be my privilege really to take some of the exercises and some of the things I've learned, the nuggets that I've taken from my dad over the years, and be able to share those with you in these podcast settings as exercises that might be additive and helpful for you and where you are in your business or in your own personal journey. So I should start by backing up and telling you that when I asked my dad at that dinner, so okay, great, you told me to think, now tell me what you think about. I'll never forget, he took out a napkin and he drew a circle, and he broke the circle almost like he was cutting a pizza into 4 sections, and then began to tell me a process, a method of how to think critically across these 4 different dimensions of that circle. And today I'm going to just be speaking about one slice of that pie, if you will, that really points to strategy formulation, but I think is a very healthy starting point, because it forces us to kind of zoom out and ask ourselves, so like, what is strategy? We use this term a lot. And I'll never forget that it took me a while early on with my dad to be able to distinguish and even articulate, where does strategy start and stop? When is something becoming more tactical versus strategic? And how well can you really point to and understand the differences between those things? Most people, I find, actually speak in what I would call tactical or operating terms more than they speak in strategic terms. And it is a rare critical thinking mind that can distinguish between the two. For me, it didn't come easy. My dad was trying to teach me certain principles, and I want to talk about that today on the podcast. So I'll be zooming in today more specifically on a concept around strategy and strategy formulation, and how it might help you to think critically as you start to think about what are my strategies in my own personal world. Real quickly, the other 2 areas that we'll be focusing on over time, in addition to corporate soul and ethos as a whole, and then strategy and execution. One is influence. I've spent a very significant percentage of my career, decades long now, in what I would call the sales environments. But I've really, over time, been somewhat disgusted with the language of sales. I think it has a real tone to it that points to getting you or getting someone to do something, in some cases even against their better judgment or will. That's not what I'm talking about. So we've positioned our discussions around what would otherwise be referred to as sales as influence. And I think when you stop saying words like we closed the sale and start saying words like we opened the mind, we educated and helped people, then we're having an influence on someone that, yes, might lead to an incidence of revenue for your company or for your business, but also leads to a meaningful acquisition of value or something of value to them. That's more of a discussion, in my opinion, about influence and understanding, how do I engineer substantive, meaningful influence? So the first dimension being corporate soul and ethos, the second being strategy. The third dimension on these podcasts that you'll see from time to time will point to that concept of influence. And I'm super excited to share some of the things that I've learned over the years in that area. And then lastly, I've just had a lot of exposure and experience in the entrepreneurial world. I've worked with some of the top entrepreneurs in the country. I've taught hundreds and hundreds, probably into the thousands of entrepreneurs. I've been all around the globe teaching and speaking on strategy and innovation. And so some of the podcast concepts we'll be sharing and topics will be in the area of entrepreneurship as well. Today's section is really angled at the notion of strategy, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So if you can imagine me sitting with my dad on this cruise, and we're talking about, okay, what do you think about? And he draws this circle and he breaks it into 4 parts, and there's 12 steps that he was teaching me, and at the time it was kind of going over my head a bit, but these 12 steps were a critical thinking path. And the 8th step in the process was the formulation of strategy, which was interesting, right? So 7 of the 12 steps were really setting yourself up to get to strategic clarity. But I want to zoom in a little bit on the concept of strategy. Maybe to do that, I'll tell you a brief story. I had a good friend some 20 years ago that was a really good entrepreneur, and he happened to be a neighbor of mine. And he came to me and said, "Hey, have you ever played this computer game called Age of Empires?" Now, if you're a gamer, you know this is an old series of games. And I don't consider myself to be a gamer by any stretch. But he said, "You know what? This is one of the coolest games I've ever seen. And as an entrepreneur," he said, "you might be interested in playing this." And I got hooked on this game. It was a game where you were essentially a new civilization in this particular suite that I was playing in, and you had a group of people that were on a map, and you were kind of hovering over this group of people at a certain elevation, and you could explore this map, and you were all the way back to like Stone Age and Iron Age and Bronze Age, and you would then begin to organize these people around where they were, and they would start working, and you would direct the work to build a civilization. So, for example, if you had a bunch of trees that were by you, you would click on one of these people in the game, and then you would click on a tree, and then they would go and mysteriously pull out an axe and start chopping a tree down and collecting wood. You might have another group that you sent foraging for berries, and over time, your wood was growing, and they would keep track of that in the scoring system. And then you would have a section that was on food, and your food score would grow. And as you can imagine, even though this was easily a rated PG game, you could create more people, and as a result of having enough food, you could have more people, and so you would continue to build a civilization. And as you might imagine, this didn't have a happy ending. If your people were in a blue loincloth, there were people over here in a red loincloth, and over time, they would really work to build up their civilization, and then it kind of culminated with these wars, hence the name Age of Empires. Well, why would I tell you this, right? Why I'm talking about strategy? Well, this game, it kept track of wood, it kept track of stone, it kept track of gold, it kept track of the number of people you had. And as you grew in the scores of these different things, then you could actually deploy them differently. And it's interesting, as a young man, my dad, I'll never forget this, my dad was trying to memorize a definition. And I remember him kind of mumbling it under his breath. The way my dad would memorize something is he would say it over and over and over again to kind of pound it into his head. But I heard him mumbling something, and finally, after having heard it a few times, I said, "What are you doing? Like, what are you saying?" And he said, "I'm trying to memorize what I think is the best definition of strategy I've ever heard." Well, the time I could care less about this. I think it was in high school when we were having this conversation. But for some reason, I never forgot what he said. He said, I said, "Well, what is it? What's the definition?" And he said, "The definition is strategy is nothing more than how you capitalize on, leverage, or even exploit available resources to create a sustainable competitive advantage." Now, I'm going to say it again. It's a bit of a mouthful. He said, "The strategy is nothing more than how you leverage, capitalize, or even exploit available resources to create a sustainable competitive advantage." So we sat and talked a little bit about that, and I have to be honest, at the time I dismissed it, but for whatever reason, maybe some foreshadowing that I would be teaching this, and I've taught this all around the world, that stuck with me. And so here we were, fast forward, I'm graduating from the university, I'm excited to get into the business community, and my dad begins to tell me about this critical thinking path. And we get to the area of strategies, and he restates that definition, which I said, I remember you saying that definition to me many, many years ago. Well, why would I connect the dots with that and with this game, Age of Empires, if I go back to the computer game? Well, back in the day when you didn't download games from the net or the web, you would actually go to a Target or a Walmart or a Media Play or these older stores, and you would actually purchase the CDs for this game. And if you had gone to Walmart to buy this computer game at the time, you would have walked in and you would have seen a lot of broad categories of games. But this game, Age of Empires, was found and recognized as a strategy game. It was a strategy game. And in fact, that was the category, and it won awards for best strategy game for many, many years. It's a Microsoft suite of games. Well, here I am playing this game, and I got pretty into it, and I don't know why I was so drawn to it. To be honest, I don't play computer games today to speak of, but for this particular game really captured my attention. And then it occurs to me, strategy is nothing more than how you leverage, capitalize, or even exploit available resources to create sustainable competitive advantage. And I'm staring at this computer screen and I'm tracking wood. Well, what's wood? Wood is a resource. What are the people? Human resource. Food, it's a resource. Water, it's a resource. Gold, a resource. Even stone, a resource. And here you are in this computer game having to assess the resources around you, make sense of them. For example, are you around an enormous forest and you have tons of wood that you can deploy? Are you right on the coast of water and you have the ocean and fishing and all sorts of things? And it just seems so simple to me at the moment, but my dad was saying, what is strategy? Really good strategists, right, understand that it's all about how you capitalize on, leverage, and take full advantage or even exploit your resources. Hence the game Age of Empires being called a strategy game. Well, what about the back end? With what end in mind, right? Well, the end in mind is sustainable, competitive advantage. And that speaks to the notion that there's going to be another group of people that want the same resources for the leveraging and capitalizing to their own objectives and ends. Now, you can create allies to that outcome, or you can compete for those resources. And really, the notion of sustainable competitive advantage, we could spend an entire podcast just unpacking what that's all about. What makes something sustainable as a competitive advantage? Now, can you imagine, like I've said in other podcasts, I didn't grow up with a dad where we were in the driveway shooting baskets together. This is this kind of stuff I talked with my dad about. And I was the youngest of four in the home, so I was kind of growing up when he was pretty mature in his career, and we would volley and talk about these different things. And as he started to teach me these principles, and then I would see them punctuated or affirmed by my own experience, even with something as simple as a computer game, a Microsoft game, I started to realize, okay, this is an interesting concept. And early in my career, I decided, and this is kind of the thesis of what I want to talk about today, how good are you at understanding, enumerating, prioritizing, leveraging, capitalizing, and even exploiting appropriately? And I use the word exploit in the notion or definition or synonyms of further, promote, take full advantage of, certainly not exploiting in a negative way. But how good are you at knowing the resources around you? And this is what I would like to just suggest to you on this podcast today is I have found in my career that most people do not understand, have not taken the time to understand the full resources available to them to win. Now, let's talk about if you work in a corporate setting, right? Small, mid-sized business, or even a large business. There are resources there, and you can leverage those resources strategically to create a winning outcome. And that can be departmental. If you're in the marketing department, or if you're in the sales department, or if you're in the IT department, every department of an organization has access to a pool of resources. And my dad began early in my career to force me to do a resource enumeration. And he would say, step back and start listing every resource that you have that can be leveraged or capitalized strategically. And this one concept changed my entire career. I'll give you one example of this. I was working for the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, and my first real experience coming out of college was a company they called Money, M-O-N-Y, for Mutual of New York. Old, stodgy insurance company that has since been purchased and completely metabolized by ASEA and Equitable. But Mutual of New York, or Money as we called it, the Money Life Insurance Company, was a big organization, probably a $65 billion assets under management entity. While I was working at Mutual of New York, I was made a general manager over Arizona and New Mexico. And this was really the early stages of what I would consider the real download of how to think strategically that my dad was giving to me. And it was during this time that he was saying, okay, I want you to make a resource enumeration list. I want you to list every resource that you have access to. Well, I started with the basics. I started with things that I knew I had around me. But he said, well, no, you've worked for a very large company. I want you to tell me different departments in the organization and different purposes they have. He says, if you really start to plumb the depths of where the resources are allocated, and by that certainly he meant money or people, technology, systems, tools. And so I started to do that. And it was a real fascinating exercise because I realized there were enormous pockets of resources that I didn't even know existed. And here's a quick example. So one of the steps in the 12 that I mentioned is to clarify strategic intent. And at the time I was running an agency on 24th and Camelback in what's called the Financial District of Phoenix at the Esplanade. It was an awesome office right behind the Ritz-Carlton in Phoenix. And I had written that I wanted to build the premier entry-level financial services organization in the greater Phoenix area, with particular emphasis on emerging community-based markets. And I had zoomed in on 3 community-based markets that I wanted to focus on. One was the Hispanic population. I speak Spanish fluently, and I wanted to work closely with that group of people in Phoenix. The Asian American community there, roughly 10% of the Phoenix Valley was Asian American, and I wanted to work with that group. And then the third group was I wanted to work with women business owners. And so I had made that declaration as part of my strategic process. That's one of the steps my dad had taught me to do, clarify your strategic intent. Well, then what am I going to do, or how am I going to accomplish that gets into strategy. Now, remember his definition. Strategy is nothing more than how you capitalize on, leverage, or even exploit to full advantage the available resources you have. So I started to call out to the departments back in Manhattan of my company. And I started researching, and I found that we had a whole diversity group focused on developing diverse employee and agent populations. There was a whole division of the company dedicated to working in the women-owned business space and to developing women financial advisors. And so as I started to work on this, I realized there are resources that I can take full advantage of. So in one instance, in the case of women-owned businesses, I gathered every possible communication tool in the Phoenix Valley that I could find that pointed and aimed at women. And it was a broad spectrum. Some of it was more lifestyle-based, all the way up to grassroots kind of commerce and opportunity development for women. And one of those communications was a tool called the Arizona Women's News. And at the time, there were 2 people, Terry Williams and Margot Dorfman, that were running the Arizona Women's News. So I invited them to come down to my office and wanted to better understand their strategy and what they were trying to accomplish. And we sat and had a wonderful conversation, and they shared their vision and their mission and kind of their ethos, if you will, what their corporate soul was at the time. And it was deeply committed to developing the opportunities for women. And then I shared with them my strategic intent, which was to build the premier entry-level financial services organization in that area, with particular emphasis on the emerging community-based market of women-owned business. And they said, perfect alignment. Now, had I not gone and done this resource enumeration, I wouldn't have known that there were pockets of resources that I could take full advantage of in service of supporting women-owned businesses. And those were back in Manhattan. And I was able to connect the dots with those resources, and in this case, the Arizona Women's News and some of the advertising objectives they had, some of the events they started to host, and really built a strong relationship with Terry and Margot as we started working together in service of women-owned businesses. And if you can imagine this is, I'll have to bring a picture in and maybe even layer this into the podcast downstream. But they came to me and said, Tyler, we want to start the Arizona Women's Chamber of Commerce, and we want your help. And I said, I'm happy to help, but there has to be an Arizona Women's Chamber already. I mean, there was the Native American Chamber, there was the African American Chamber, there was the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, there was every chamber possible. And they said, there is not an Arizona Women's Chamber of Commerce. And I said, well, then I'm invested. I want to do it with you. And sure enough, we used my office right there on 24th and Camelback, and we chartered it and we launched it. And it wasn't a few months later, I even got them office space in my agency, developing and working on initiatives to support the Women's Chamber in Arizona. And then I can't remember how many months later they came and said, Tyler, there's no U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce. We want to launch the U.S. Women's Chamber. And we had done a deep dive looking into all of the different organizations in the country. And sure enough, there was the Women's Business Enterprise Council, WEBEC. There was the National Association of Women Business Owners, NABO. There were a lot of different organizations serving a similar constituency, but there was no U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce. And this would have been early 2000s, which is kind of surprising. And they looked at me and said, we want to build out the U.S. Women's Chamber. And I said, I want to support you in doing that. And that was, gosh, that's almost been 20 years ago, 19 to 20 years ago. And I sat many years as an advisor to them on their advisory board, working probably upwards of 7 full years working with Margot and Terry, helping them to launch the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce. And you may say, well, what does that have to do with strategy? Go back to what my dad had tasked me doing. Go back to his definition of strategy, which is understanding the resources that you have available to you and around you that can be leveraged or capitalized on to create sustainable competitive advantage. Well, as I moved forward and went to recruit women financial advisors, whether that was on campuses at Arizona State or other universities, University of Arizona in Tucson, or even experienced financial advisors that were already in the game with other large players in the financial sector, all I had to do to them is say, well, not only do I sit on the board of and helped found the Arizona Women's Chamber of Commerce, but I was right there at the grounding of the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce, and we have all sorts of opportunities to work closely with and align with them. And it was just a fascinating experience off one simple concept, which was really explore the resources that you have available to you. In this case, my company was setting aside resources to support an initiative to make sure that we were growing a women financial advisor kind of core of people. And as you know, that's an industry that's hyper male dominant. It's not properly balanced in terms of its representation. I should say parenthetically, and as a little bit of a postscript, the U.S. Women's Chamber went on to sue the SBA for not allocating resources back to women-owned businesses as their charter suggested and not living true to legislation. They've had a huge effect. They ended up moving to D.C. to lobby and fight for women-owned businesses in many different ways. In one way, for example, is procurement councils to help women get government contracts and grow their businesses that way. It's just been an interesting journey for them, and I was so fortunate to be aligned with that early on, and I'm a huge believer and proponent in women-owned businesses and success. And yet, if you said, would that have ever really happened if my dad hadn't said, remember, strategy is about resources. Remember my game, wood, stone, gold, people, these are resources. The smart ones, the strategic ones are the ones that step back, they audit the resources they have around them and get really clear on where they are. And they don't just see the obvious ones. They go deeper and look for resources they may not have considered. This could include competencies that you may have or that may be around you that can be taken full advantage of. And it's when you do these enumerations or audits of the various resources, you may find there are relationships, there are dollars in budgets, there are initiatives going on inside organizations. This could be a very small business. If you're a home-based business player, it could be the organizations you're aligned with that provide product or compensation. If you're an entrepreneur, it could be alliance relationships in an ecosystem or in an area where you work. Could be national associations and companies. One thing is for sure, if I had a chance to sit and just volley with you and really push on you to say, where are the resources that you can take better advantage of to create sustainable competitive advantage in your space, I've got a dollar bet to a dime that I can help you find areas that you're not exploiting. Again, I use the word exploit in a very positive sense. I'm not saying we ever are exploiting people or anything. No, we're exploiting resources, things that we can use to promote and take full advantage and ultimately create strategic differentiation that we can win by. That little experience, which was several years with the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce, was a real not only blessing in my life. I had a wonderful time. Anytime I had a chance to meet with them or get involved there, it was a wonderful experience. But what I learned also from it is, if I hadn't really looked for those resources inside my own company that could be brought to bear in support of that intention, that strategic intent to develop and promote women-owned businesses, I would have not had the resources or connection to create that advantage. And when I went out to recruit and when I went out to build my team, and I could say emphatically that we had deep, deep inroads into that women community, women-owned business community, and people could see that, I had an advantage that was sustainable over time. And not only that, it was just a wonderful, wonderful cause, and they've done so many great things. Margot and Terry are just amazing, and I look back on that time with fondness and frankly, gratitude and humility that I was in that space at the time. But I would have missed it. I think that's what I'm trying to signal to all of you, is I would have missed it. And I talk a lot in different settings about what I call dusty resources. There are resources around you that probably are dusty, that aren't being leveraged to their full extent. There's two ways to look at it. Sometimes a corporation can be applying a lot of resource attention to something that you may feel is not leverageable in your way of thinking. In any regard, I think you owe it to yourself to still plumb the depths of where are resources being spent in service of something that I can take full advantage of. And I will submit to you that if you can do that, you'll end up finding things that aren't being taken advantage of, these dusty resources I'm speaking about. And it will kind of give you a chance to rethink strategy. Now, by no stretch have I given you even a fraction, even 1/100th of what these process steps are that my dad shared with me years ago. We've coined a phrase, a strategic link is the name of the process that my dad created and refined. And I've taught that process all around the world to lots of different businesses. But central to that process is the formulation and clarification of strategy. And central to strategy formulation and clarification is resource identification. Can be money, certainly can be talent, can be competencies, can be technologies, can be process advantages, could be a location advantage depending on the type of business you're in. But when you start to really explore where are the resources, where are the competencies, where are any leverageable advantages that you can take and really further promote to your own intentions, that's when you're starting to think more strategically. And so I'm really excited about the concept of teaching this a little bit more. And I would challenge you coming off this podcast to say, okay, how good am I at doing this? And how good am I at understanding the resources around me and thinking about how those can be marshaled? Be careful. I'm not saying you're exploiting them negatively or abusing them. I'm just saying go out there and see what you can take full advantage of. It's been my experience, most people don't do that enough. And they don't, to my dad's advice, they don't think critically enough about where are these resources and how can I marshal them to my own strategic intentions that align with a bigger set of outcomes and purposes. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover today. And it speaks to the idea that strategy is nothing more than how you capitalize on and leverage available resources, which in that definition, it presumes that you are able to see and articulate the resources that you can take full advantage of. And I find a lot of people don't spend enough time on just that resource audit or enumeration. My dad would make me make a T-graph on a page and start listing every resource I had available to me. And then kind of say, go back, keep digging. There's got to be more. There's got to be more. And then I could look at that stack of resources and say, in service of my intentions and objectives, which of these resources are strategic? Which of these resources could I fully take advantage of? gosh, just that exercise alone, having taught this to a lot of different people, can be very, very instructive and enlightening to you about what's missing, what you may not be taking advantage of, and start to give you almost kind of little hints or clues to where you have some strategic opportunity. So guys, I hope that's helpful to you, this idea that strategy is all about resource leverage to create advantage in your environments. And there's a lot there. I hope you'll spend some time considering it. Take some time and pull out a piece of paper and list out every resource and advantage or competency that you can leverage to your own ends in an appropriate way. And I think you'll be surprised. You're going to see some real latent potential and strategy that you can pull out that'll further your objectives and intentions. So thanks for joining us today on the podcast, the Corporate Soul Podcasts. Again, hope this is helpful. Look forward to sharing more about strategy and execution and all the other dimensions of this as we move forward. See you guys. Have a great day.